Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today, we are exploring a mind-bending paradox. We're looking at the writings of a young woman who lived in a sealed convent in 19th century France, yet who described with terrifying accuracy the modern experience of atheism and the void. We are unpacking the story of Thérèse of Lisieux, a figure who proposed that the way to the divine isn't through strength, but through absolute weakness, and who at her lowest point sat at the table of sinners to eat the bread of sorrow.
It's a look at God, not as a judge, but as a parent who is, almost blind to our faults.
Yeah.
And it's a look at faith that has to survive even when the lights go completely out.
We are diving into her autobiography, The Story of a Soul, and we aren't just doing a biography here. We are really trying to analyze her, frankly, radical concepts of the divine, her wrestling with nothingness, and this little way of hers that challenged centuries of very complex and, I would say, very intimidating theology.
It really did. It was a quiet revolution.
So before we get into the heavy stuff, and believe me, it gets very heavy, I want to set the scene. Because when I think of a 19th century nun, I have this very specific image in my head.
I think we all do.
Right. I'm thinking gentle, maybe a bit detached from reality, floating around a garden, praying for peace. Just very soft.
That is the popular image. They call her the little flower. It sounds like something you'd see on a greeting card.
Exactly. It sounds harmless. But then I started reading the source material you sent over, and I realized this woman was actually dealing with some incredibly dark, almost existential themes. It felt less like a greeting card and, at points, more like a psychological thriller.
That's a great way to put it.
But to understand why her ideas were so radical, we have to understand the world she was reacting to. She wasn't writing in a vacuum. What was the vibe in French Catholicism in the late 1800s?
Vibe is a light word for something that was actually quite oppressive. To really get Thérèse, you have to understand the shadow that was hanging over the church in France at that time. And that shadow was Jansenism.
Jansenism.
Okay.
I've heard the term, but I've never really understood what it meant for a regular person going to church on a Sunday. Is it a sect? A different denomination?
No, and that's what makes it so insidious. It was a theological movement within Catholicism. And even though it had been officially condemned by the popes by the time Thérèse was born, the cultural impact was still everywhere. It had soaked into the walls.
So what did it look like in practice?
Imagine a version of Christianity that is obsessed, and I mean absolutely obsessed, with moral rigor and the justice of God. But not justice in a good way.
Justice as in punishment.
Precisely. The Jansenist view of God was primarily as a judge, a severe cosmic accountant. The entire spiritual life was treated like a ledger. You have two columns. In one column, you have your merits, your prayers, your fasting, your good deeds.
Okay.
And in the other column, you have your debts. Every sin, every imperfection, every moment of distraction in prayer, it all goes on the list.
That sounds incredibly stressful.
Yeah.
It's like living your entire spiritual life inside a performance review that never, ever ends.
That's a perfect way to put it. It was a spiritual performance review where the boss is actively looking for a reason to fire you. The goal of life under this influence was to stockpile enough merit to outweigh your debt so that when you died, you might, and that's a very big might, make it to heaven.
Wow.
It created this culture of intense anxiety. Scrupulosity was rampant. People were terrified to take communion because they didn't feel worthy enough. They were constantly looking over their spiritual shoulder, analyzing their own motives, terrified that they had slipped up somewhere and added another black mark to the ledger.
So it's almost like a spiritual capitalism. You're earning currency to buy your own safety after you die.
Exactly. And what does a system like that value? It values strength. It values perfection. It breeds a specific kind of neurosis where you are constantly trying to hide your weaknesses, even from God. You have to be strong. You have to be perfect. You have to climb the mountain by sheer force of will.
And into this pressure cooker comes Thérèse. And what I found so fascinating in the text is that she doesn't just argue against this, she completely subverts it. She flips the whole table.
She doesn't just flip the table, she changes the entire game. She looks at this ledger approach, this obsession with divine justice, and she redefines what justice actually means.
This part really stuck with me. She talks about the justice of God, but she doesn't mean punishment. I think most people, even today, if you say the words divine justice, they think of lightning bolts. They think of getting what you deserve.
Right. It has a negative connotation. I hope they get justice. It's usually vindictive.
But Thérèse takes it in a completely different direction.
Yeah.
She uses this logic that is almost, I don't know, it's like a lawyer's argument. It's so clean.
It is remarkably logical.
Hmm.
She says, essentially, if God is infinitely just, that means he is infinitely accurate. He sees things exactly as they are. No distortions.
Okay, that makes sense.
So if God sees things exactly as they are, he knows exactly how fragile human beings are. He knows we are made of dust. He knows our biology, our psychology, our limitations because he made us.
Right.
A truly just judge in a human courtroom takes the capacity of the accused into account, right?
Hmm.
You don't judge a child by the same standard as an adult.
That's
So
right.
Thérèse argues that because God is just, he cannot demand from us what we do not have. He cannot demand perfection from a creature he knows is imperfect by design.
That is such a comforting pivot.
It
It turns justice from a threat into a safety net.
Yes.
Because he knows I'm weak, his justice means he won't expect me to be strong.
Exactly. For Thérèse, God's justice is the very reason for her hope. She says, and I'm paraphrasing here, I am not afraid of his justice because a just God has to be compassionate to weakness. It completely dismantles the fear that Jansenism built its entire structure on.
But she goes even further than that, and this is where I actually laughed out loud while reading the notes. She has this anecdote about God being blind.
Ah, yes, the conversation with the novel.
Yes. She's talking to a younger nun who is just freaking out about her faults. A classic case of Jansenist anxiety. I'm not good enough, I keep messing up. And Therese tells her that Jesus has a great infirmity. An illness, basically.
It's scandalous if you take it literally. She tells this young girl that Jesus is blind. And not only is he blind, but he is bad at math. He doesn't know how to do sums.
Which, if you're a traditional theologian, is technically heresy, right?
Yeah.
God is omniscient, he knows everything, he invented math.
In a strict dogmatic sense, yes, of course, God is all-knowing. But Thérèse is operating on a different frequency here. She's not writing a catechism, she's explaining the mechanics of love.
So what does she mean?
She tells the novice that if a sinner at the moment of death has true love in their heart, God loses the ability to calculate.
He forgets the calculation. I love that phrase.
Yes. She suggests that when love is present, God doesn't even look at the ledger. He doesn't say, okay, you loved me, but you also lost your temper 5 times this week and forgot your prayers twice. She says, he becomes positively blind to the faults. All he can see is the love.
It's like when a parent looks at their toddler. The kid might be a total mess, covered in spaghetti, screaming their head off. But if that kid runs up and gives the parent a huge hug.
The parent isn't calculating the mess.
No, they're not thinking about the laundry or the cleanup. They're just experiencing the hug. The love erases the context.
That's the image, and it's a radical rejection of the God as accountant. She's saying that love blinds judgment. It actually disables the entire mechanism of the ledger.
Which leads us perfectly to the most famous metaphor associated with her. I feel like we have to talk about the elevator.
Okay.
Or, as the French would have said, the lift.
The lift.
Yeah.
Ascenseur. This blew my mind because, again, we're talking about 1897. I don't associate nuns in the 1890s with high-tech machinery. But she uses this very modern invention to explain her theology. It just shows how attentive she was to the world around her, even from inside the cloister. Elevators were the cutting-edge tech of the late 19th century. They were luxury items in big Parisian department stores or grand hotels. And for people back then, they were almost magical. You step into a box, and without any effort on your part, you ascend.
And she contrasts this with a staircase.
Right. And to understand the power of the elevator metaphor, you have to really understand the staircase. For centuries, the path to holiness was described as a ladder or a staircase. You read the lives of the great saints, the eagles, as she called them, and what do you see?
You see effort. Extreme effort. Fasting for 40 days, wearing hair shirts, sleeping on the floor, preaching to thousands. It's a spiritual workout.
It's an athletic feat. You are climbing step by painful step toward God. And the assumption in that Jansenist world is that you need strength to do that. You need spiritual muscle.
And Therese looks at this staircase.
She looks at it and she admits defeat. Right from the start, she says, I am too small. I cannot climb this rude staircase of perfection. She felt physically and spiritually weak. She couldn't do the great fasts. She'd get sick. She couldn't do the great deeds. She was hidden away in a convent.
So in the Jansenist worldview, she's a failure. She's stuck on the ground floor.
By the standards of greatness, yes. But she doesn't despair. She says, we live in a century of inventions. And she reasons that if rich people can use an elevator to avoid the effort of climbing stairs, surely God, who is richer and kinder than any human inventor, must have a spiritual elevator for the little people.
I love the audacity of that. It's like she's saying, God, where's my shortcut?
It is audacious. She goes to the scriptures looking for this elevator, and she finds these passages about being carried. As one whom a mother comforts, so will I comfort you, or he will gather the lambs in his arms.
So the elevator is the arms of Jesus.
Correct. But here is the crucial theological shift. I want to make sure we don't miss this, because it changes everything. Think about the mechanics of an elevator. When you get in an elevator, what is your job?
To stand there. You push the button, maybe, but mostly you just wait. You do nothing.
You are passive. You don't jump up and down. You don't try to climb the walls. In fact, if you started jumping around, you'd be a nuisance to the whole operation. Your job is to be small and let the mechanism carry you.
So she's replacing a theology of climbing with a theology of being carried.
Yes. Or even more accurately, a theology of descent. She realized that she didn't need to grow up to reach God. She needed to remain little so that God would be compelled to descend to pick her up. It's the exact opposite of the merit-based system.
How so?
The merit system says, become strong so you can reach God. Thérèse says, acknowledge you are weak so God can reach you.
It takes all the pressure off.
It does. But it also requires a terrifying amount of trust. Because if you are climbing the stairs, you are in control. You know how high you are. You can look down and say, I climbed 50 steps today. You have your metrics.
Right. You have your ledger.
But if you are in the elevator, you are completely dependent on the operator. You have no control. You have to trust that the arms will actually hold you, that the cable won't snap.
And that leads us perfectly into the next section. Because it's easy to talk about trusting the elevator when things are going well. It's a cute metaphor. But Thérèse didn't just write this stuff while having a great time. She lived this trust through something that sounds absolutely horrifying.
This is the part of her life that often gets scrubbed from the popular, sanitized narrative. People want the roses and the cute little way. They don't want the darkness. But you cannot understand Thérèse without understanding the trial of faith she went through at the end of her life.
This started around Easter of 1896, right? Mm-hmm.
Yes, the timing is crucial. She had just contracted tuberculosis. She had the first definitive sign hemoptysis, coughing up blood into her handkerchief. For her, initially, this was actually a joyful moment.
Joyful?
Yes. She thought, great, the bridegroom is coming to take me home to heaven. She saw it as a summons.
Which is a very saintly reaction. Yay, I'm dying.
Right. She expected the end of her life to be this glorious transition into light and certainty, but then, just a few days later, the spiritual lights went out. Completely.
Describe what that means, because people use the phrase dark night of the soul a lot, and usually just means I felt a bit sad or God felt distant for a week. But this sounds different. This sounds clinical.
It was much more severe than just spiritual dryness. Thérèse describes a wall rising up between her and heaven. She says that up until that point, her faith was so clear, so intuitive, that she felt she could almost touch the other side. She had a deep emotional certainty that heaven existed. And then nothing. It wasn't just that she couldn't feel God. That happens to people. This was different. She was assaulted by the very distinct intellectual possibility that God does not exist.
We have the text here where she describes the voice of this darkness. I want to read a bit of it because it actually gave me chills. It sounds so modern. She writes that the darkness mocks her, saying, dream on about your light and your sweet fragrances. Death will not bring you what you hope for, but a night still deeper, the night of nothingness.
The night of nothingness. That is the voice of materialism. That is the voice of 19th century atheism. You know, Nietzsche, Freud, the whole growing secular wave echoing inside the mind of a cloistered Carmelite nun.
It's basically the voice saying, you are a biological accident. Your consciousness is an illusion. When you die, you rot. There is no heaven. You've wasted your entire life in this convent for a delusion.
Precisely. And she was hearing this voice constantly. It wasn't a fleeting doubt. It was a thick fog that she lived in for the last 18 months of her life. And remember, she is physically dying at the same time. She is suffocating from TB. So she has the physical pain, and simultaneously, every ounce of spiritual comfort is ripped away. She is left staring into the void.
I think most people, especially if they were a religious leader or a figure people looked up to, would try to hide this. Or they would fight it by arguing, trying to prove God exists with logic, trying to shout down the voice. But Thérèse does something so strange, so counterintuitive. She talks about the table of sinners.
This is her stroke of genius. This is where her theology of weakness becomes heroic. She imagines a table, a banquet table.
And who is at this table?
Poor sinners. That's her term for unbelievers, atheists. The people who have rejected the faith or who simply cannot believe, she imagines them all sitting at this table and they're eating bitter bread.
The bread of sorrow, the bread of a life without meaning, without hope of an afterlife.
Yes. And traditionally, a saint is supposed to separate themselves from sinners, come out from among them. But Thérèse says, I will sit there.
She joins them. She takes a seat at the table.
She tells God that she is willing to eat that bitter bread of sorrow for as long as he wishes. She refuses to leave the table. She essentially says, I will be an atheist with the atheists for the sake of the atheists, so that you might show them mercy.
That's incredibly heavy.
Yeah.
She isn't condemning the atheists for their lack of faith. She is choosing to experience their darkness with them.
It's the ultimate act of solidarity. She reframes her own doubt. Instead of viewing the doubt as a punishment for her own sins or personal failure, she views it as a participation in the suffering of her brothers and sisters who have no faith.
So she's offering her own soul as a space to carry their burden.
Yes. She says, Lord, let me sit in their darkness. I will believe for them. I will carry the weight of this void so that perhaps for a moment they might see the light that I can't see anymore.
It changes the whole dynamic of doubt. Doubt isn't a failure anymore, it's a vocation. It's a job she's taking on.
Exactly. She turns the experience of godlessness into an act of love. It is the most powerful thing she ever did.
But practically speaking, how did she handle this day to day? Because if I'm hearing a voice in my head saying God is a lie and I'm coughing up blood, I'm probably going to stop praying. I'm going to stop going through the motions. I'm going to curl up in a ball.
And that is where her sheer force of will comes in. She makes a critical distinction between feeling and action. She says she acts as if,
Like fake it till you make it.
in a way, but I think it's deeper than that. She compares it to a duel. She says when the enemy, the doubt, attacks her with its arguments, she doesn't engage. She doesn't argue back. She says she turns her back on the adversary and runs to Jesus. She tells him, I don't believe you were there, but I love you anyway.
Wait, I don't believe you're there, but I love you anyway? That is a complete paradox. How can you love something you don't believe exists?
It's the ultimate paradox, and it's the core of her final spiritual state. She writes, I have never made so many acts of faith as I have during this time. Because for her, true faith isn't feeling that God is there. It's choosing God when you feel nothing. It's a pure act of the will. She was walking in pitch blackness, holding out a hand she couldn't feel, trusting that the elevator was still moving even though all her senses told her she was standing still in a dark room.
It really challenges our modern idea of authenticity, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We think being authentic means I have to act on what I feel right now.
Mm.
Thérèse is saying something different. She's saying being authentic means acting on what I have committed to, regardless of what I feel.
Yes. She proves that, at its most tested point, faith is a decision, not an emotion.
I want to switch gears slightly because amidst all this darkness and these big theological concepts, she uses another metaphor that I found surprisingly technical, and it gives us a real glimpse into how her mind worked.
The kaleidoscope.
Yeah, yes, the kaleidoscope.
Did you have one of these as a kid? The little cardboard tube you look through? I did. You twist the end and the patterns just magically change. It's mesmerizing.
So Thérèse is writing about this, and she doesn't just look through it, she takes it apart, which I love. She's a hacker. She has to know how the machine works.
It tells you she wasn't just a passive dreamer. She was curious, analytical. So she dismantles this toy, and what does she find inside?
I assume she expects to find, I don't know, tiny gems, little diamonds, something beautiful to make the beautiful patterns.
Right, that would be the logical assumption. But when you open a kaleidoscope, what's actually in there?
It's junk.
It's garbage. She finds bits of wool, cut up pieces of colored paper, maybe a stray hair. It's literally trash. Rubbish.
So the beautiful patterns aren't coming from the objects themselves.
No. She has this epiphany. She realizes there are 3 mirrors inside the tube, arranged in a triangle, and when those bits of rubbish are viewed inside the focus of the mirrors, they are multiplied and reflected into these magnificent, symmetrical, almost cathedral-like patterns.
Okay, I think I see where this is going. We are the trash.
We are the bits of wool.
Ouch. Thanks, Thérèse. That's uplifting.
It's humbling, but it's also incredibly liberating. She's saying, look, your actions, your daily life might feel like just bits of wool. You're just washing the dishes, you're answering emails, you're dealing with a crying baby. It's not a diamond, it's just gray wool. It feels totally insignificant. But if that gray wool is placed inside the focus of the mirrors, and for her, the 3 mirrors represent the Trinity, or more simply, divine love, what happens to it?
It becomes a masterpiece. It's beautiful.
Exactly. The beauty of the pattern doesn't depend on the quality of the object. It depends entirely on the position of the object relative to the mirrors.
That is a massive paradigm shift
Yeah.
because we spend our whole lives trying to turn our wool into diamonds. We try to do big things. We want our lives to be impressive. Thérèse is saying, stop trying to be a diamond. Just stay in the mirrors.
It validated her entire existence. Remember, she's in a sealed convent. She isn't discovering cures for diseases. She isn't fighting wars. She isn't writing symphonies. She is doing laundry. She's sweeping the floor. She's dealing with difficult personalities in her community. By the world's standards, her life is just bits of paper.
Right.
But the kaleidoscope analogy allows her to believe that her small, hidden life, when focused through love, is generating infinite beauty in the eyes of God.
It democratizes holiness. You don't have to be a superstar. You just have to be in the right place spiritually.
Precisely. And she warns that the opposite is true. If you have a diamond, let's say a huge heroic deed, give millions to charity, but it slips out of the focus of the mirrors. If it's done for ego or for public praise or without love,
It's just a rock. It loses its beauty.
it loses its symmetry. In God's eyes, it's of no value.
Speaking of doing big things, though, I think we need to correct a possible misconception here. Because all this talk of the little way makes her sound very, well, little, meek, almost passive. But when you read her private journals, this woman had an ego. Or maybe not an ego, but an ambition. A massive spiritual ambition.
Oh, her desires were colossal. If she were alive today, she'd probably be a Fortune 500 CEO or a world leader. She writes explicitly that she feels the vocation of a warrior.
She wanted to be Joan of Arc.
She wanted to be a priest. She wanted to be an apostle, a missionary. She wanted to be a doctor of the church, one of the great teachers. She wanted to be a martyr. And not just any martyr. She writes that she wanted to suffer every form of martyrdom ever invented. Boiling oil, beheading, being thrown to wild beasts. She wanted the whole menu.
Which is so tragic because she's a woman in the 19th century church. She's barred from the priesthood. She's a cloistered nun, so she's barred from being a missionary. And she's sick for much of her life, so she's barred from most active work. She is boxed in on every single side.
It was a source of real torment for her for a long time. She talks about this martyrdom of desire. She felt these infinite longings trapped in a finite container. She wanted to travel to all four corners of the earth and preach the gospel simultaneously. It was a holy madness.
So how does she resolve this? Because that sounds like a recipe for deep bitterness, being stuck in a cell when you feel like you were born to conquer the world.
She turns to the Bible, as she always does, specifically to St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 12. He uses the metaphor of the body of Christ.
Right. The church is a body. The eye can't be the hand can't be the foot. Everyone has their part.
And Thérèse reads this, looking for her part. She asks, am I the hand? No, she's not doing active work. Am I the foot? No, she's not traveling. Am I the eye? No, she's not a great theologian leading the way with new insights. She doesn't fit into any of the active roles.
She doesn't fit. She's an organ donor with no matching recipient.
For a moment, it seems that way. But then she keeps reading into chapter 13, the great chapter on love. And she has an anatomical realization. She realizes that for a body to move, for the hand to lift, or the foot to walk, or the eye to see, it needs something else, something central.
A pump.
A heart. She realizes that if the heart stops beating, the apostles stop preaching. If the heart stops, the martyrs drop their swords. The heart is hidden, it's unseen, but it pumps the blood that fuels every other organ.
And that leads to her famous declaration. I have it right here. In the heart of the church, my mother, I will be love.
That is the moment everything clicks into place for her. By choosing to become the heart, by focusing purely on generating love through her small actions and prayers and sufferings, she realized she could participate in every other vocation simultaneously.
So when a missionary baptizes someone in China,
Thérèse believed she was there, pumping the spiritual blood to his arm. When a martyr dies in the arena, she believed she was there, fueling their courage. When a priest preaches a sermon, she's there, giving fire to his words.
it allowed her to be secluded and universal at the same time. She found the leverage point.
She actually quotes Archimedes, "Give me a lever and a place to stand, and I will move the world." For her, the lever was prayer and sacrifice, and the fulcrum was love. She believed she could impact the entire globe without ever leaving her cell.
It's a very systemic way of looking at spirituality. It's almost like grid energy. She's the power plant, everyone else is the appliance drawing from that power.
That's a great analogy. She is generating the voltage.
I want to touch on one more metaphor she uses, because I think it speaks to anyone who struggles with comparison, which is basically everyone today. We live in the age of Instagram and LinkedIn. Everyone looks like a rose. Everyone is successful and beautiful and important. Thérèse struggled with this too. She asked, why are some souls so big and others so small?
This is her Garden of Souls concept. She looked around and wondered why God didn't make everyone an eagle or a rose, a great majestic saint like St. Augustine or St. Paul. Why are there so many? Well, average people.
Why are there so many weeds?
Well, she calls them wildflowers. She looks at nature and realizes that the perfection of a garden doesn't consist of only having roses. If the whole world were roses, it would be monotonous, and you'd miss the beauty of the violets and the daisies.
So the little flowers have a purpose.
Their purpose is to gladden God's eyes when he looks down at his feet. But she goes deeper than that. She says that God's greatness is shown more by his ability to lower himself to the daisy than by his interaction with the rose.
How so?
A rose is big and glorious, it commands attention, but a daisy is tiny. God has to stoop down to appreciate it. She argues that just as the sun doesn't ignore the tiny flower but gives it all the light it needs, God doesn't ignore the small soul. In fact, by filling a small soul to the brim, he shows that his love is like a liquid. It takes the shape of whatever container it's poured into.
So if you are a thimble and you are full, you are just as full as a bucket that is full.
Exactly. You don't need to be a bucket, you just need to be a full thimble. It validates the little life. You don't have to be famous or powerful or brilliant to be fully illuminated by the divine.
This leads to her economic theory, which is what I'm calling it, because she talks about a bank, the bank of love.
She was oddly fixated on financial terms for a nun. Ledger, bank, spending.
She really was. But she operates this bank in a very reckless way. She calls herself a spendthrift.
This goes right back to the ledger we talked about at the start. Most religious people of her time were trying to save up merits in their spiritual bank account, building a portfolio for retirement in heaven. Thérèse refused to save.
She wanted to show up with empty hands.
Every time she did something good, a small sacrifice, a prayer, an act of charity, she immediately spent it. She mentally transferred the value to souls on the brink of hell or to missionaries who needed strength. She imagines herself standing before God at the final judgment with absolutely nothing in her hands. No resume, no portfolio.
That sounds terrifying for a control freak to show up at the final exam with no notes, having given them all away.
It is the ultimate rejection of spiritual security. But listen to her logic. It's so clever. She says, if I have empty hands, God will be forced to fill them. It's a gamble on God's nature as a father. She says if you come with your own suitcase full of merits, God acts as a judge. He has to inspect your suitcase. He might say, oh, there's a little self-love tainting this deed here. This coin looks counterfeit.
Right, the performance review.
But if you show up with nothing, like a beggar, you are just a child asking for a gift. And a father doesn't audit a child. He just gives. He's moved by the need.
She's kind of manipulating God with her own weakness.
She essentially admits that. She says she wants to win God by a ruse. The ruse is to be so small and so dependent that God's honor is at stake if he doesn't help her. It's brilliant. She's shifting the entire burden of salvation from her shoulders to God's shoulders.
Let's talk about the end.
Yeah.
Because for all this beautiful talk of love and elevators and flowers, her death was grueling. Tuberculosis is a horrible way to die. It's suffocation. It's slow and painful.
It was an agony. And remember, during that time, she refused morphine for a long time because she wanted to keep her mind clear for prayer, even when she was in this state of total darkness.
And yet, she makes this statement near the end that is just baffling. She says, I have reached the point of not being able to suffer anymore, because all suffering is sweet to me.
We have to be really careful with that quote. It sounds masochistic.
It sounds completely insane. Pain is not sweet.
She wasn't seeking pain for the sake of pain. She didn't enjoy the feeling of drowning in her own lungs. But because she had emptied her bank account, because she had no other currency, suffering became the only thing she had left to give. It became the raw material for love.
It was the fuel for the fire.
Yes. She was consciously taking her physical pain and her spiritual darkness and feeding it into the furnace of her heart to generate that love for this church, for the atheists at her table. She transmuted the suffering into mission. It wasn't about her anymore.
And speaking of mission, most people, most saints even, view heaven as a rest. The prayer is, eternal rest grant unto them.
Thérèse didn't want a rest. She said, I will spend my heaven doing good on earth.
She viewed death as a promotion. a new job with more responsibility.
She viewed it as the moment her hands would finally be untied. On earth, she was limited by her body, by the convent walls. In heaven, she believed she would be unleashed. She said she wouldn't rest until the end of the world.
And this brings us to the famous shower of roses. She predicted that after her death, she would let fall a shower of roses. And the source material we have includes these testimonials of what happened after she died in 1897. And it gets pretty wild.
It does. And whether you are a believer or a skeptic, the historical phenomenon itself is undeniable. This unknown nun from a provincial French town dies, and within years, her autobiography is a global bestseller, and thousands of people start reporting things.
Tangible things, not just feeling.
Very tangible. The shower of roses wasn't just poetic. People reported smelling the scent of roses in places where there were none, often at a moment of prayer or decision, but also healings.
There's the story of the galloping consumption.
Right. A young woman dying of the exact same disease Thérèse had, tuberculosis, who was inexplicably cured after her family started praying to Thérèse for help. Doctors had given up.
And the 50-franc note. That one is just bizarre.
It is. The convent was in debt. The sacristan needed money to pay a bill. She prayed to Thérèse, who had been in charge of the sacristy, and finds a 50-franc note, a significant sum, just lying inside a cassette box that she swore she had checked multiple times. And she says the money felt new and strange, not like normal currency.
And it wasn't just believers. There's the account of the skeptical man who read her biography story of a soul, purely as a literary or psychological exercise, and found his entire worldview dismantled by the simple, powerful logic of her little way. He converted.
These miracles, or reported miracles, they serve a specific purpose in her narrative. They act as the validation of her promise. They are the proof that she didn't just disappear into that void she feared so much. That wall of darkness she faced in her final year, she broke through it. The roses are the signal from the other side saying, I made it, the elevator works.
So let's try to bring this all together. We have a young woman hidden away in a French province who felt the cold wind of modern atheism. She felt the void. She heard the voice in her head saying, there is nothing.
And instead of crumbling, instead of fighting it, she embraced it. She turned that darkness into a table where she could sit with us, with the modern skeptics, the doubters, the people who can't believe.
She argued that God actually prefers the weak who trust him over the strong who rely on themselves. She argued that you don't need to be a diamond, you just need to be in the mirror.
And she argued that our obsession with being good enough, that ledger we all keep in our heads, religious or not, is actually a lack of trust. If you are anxious about your spiritual or moral performance, it means you think it all depends on you, Thérèse says. It never depended on you. It depends on the elevator.
It raises a really provocative question for us today, doesn't it? We live in a world that is obsessed with metrics. We track our steps, our calories, our screen time, our likes, our productivity. We are all obsessed with the ledger, Thérèse asks. Can you throw the ledger away? Can you trust that you are loved regardless of your performance?
And there's an even deeper question, one that haunts me from her final days. During that time of darkness, she served God for nothing. She loved him even when she couldn't feel him, even when the reward of heaven seemed like a childish fairy tale.
Can we love goodness just for itself? Not for the payout, not for heaven, not for good karma, not for social approval.
That is the ultimate test of the little way. To stand in the dark with no guarantee of dawn and still choose love, that is the paradox of the little flower. The smallest soul faced the biggest darkness, and she won not by fighting, but by surrendering.
We'll leave you with that thought. Can we love for nothing? Thanks for listening to this deep dive.